She was a pregnant widow, with nothing left to lose but the child beneath her heart. He was a wounded rancher being sold like cattle by his own brother, his two daughters watching in silent terror. When she spent her last dollars to buy him, it wasn't a purchase, it was a rescue. In a town that traded flesh and blood for coin, this desperate bargain between two strangers bound by grief would either forge a family strong enough to weather any storm or condemn them all to a fate worse than the auction block. Sold to the lady in black. The gavel cracked through the hot Texas air like a gunshot. All eyes turned to the far side of the auction pit, where she stood belly round, with child eyes flint and fire. Her black mourning dress clung to her like a warning. Folks whispered, "She's got no husband. She's pregnant and buys a man. She's lost her mind." But Clara Reed didn't flinch. Her boots crunched through the haste-strewn dust as she stepped forward to where the wounded rancher had just been tossed like meat onto the back of a wagon. The man hadn't moved. Blood soaked through his torn shirt at the shoulder and ribs. His wrists were bound, lips cracked with heat and thirst. Near him, two little girls, no older than 7 and maybe 5, stood trembling, and barefoot eyes wide and too hollow for their age. Clara turned to the man who'd just been outbid. A thick-set brute with yellow teeth and a wide brim hat sneered. "You just bought yourself trouble, widow," he spat, lifting a boot toward the rancher again. Clara moved like thunder. Before the man's foot could land, her hand snapped out the handle of her parasol, striking his shin hard enough to make him howl. "Touch him again, and I'll buy you next. And work you till you beg to be buried." The crowd gasped. No one laughed. She turned to the auctioneer, a man with a dusty ledger and eyes too tired to question justice. "Unbind him and give me their names." The auctioneer cleared his throat. "He's Micah Callan, a rancher," they said. "Cattleman until a land war put him under. Those are his daughters, Lahi and June." Clara knelt beside them. Lahi, June. The older one, Lahi, nodded slowly. "That's us, ma'am. I'm Clara," she said, her voice cracking gently. "And you're coming home with me." They hadn't spoken a word the entire wagon ride home. Micah drifted in and out of consciousness. Fever licked at his temples. Every jolt of the cart sent fire through his side. He remembered falling. He remembered his brother selling him like a cow too old to breed. He remembered someone yelling, then soft hands, and now the jostle of wheels and the smell of lavender soap mixed with dust and blood. When he woke again, it was to candlelight and clean sheets. A basin sat beside him, red with the water used to clean his wounds. The room was simple walls of wood planks and a small window cracked to the night. He tried to sit up and failed. Clara appeared with a towel in one hand and a tray in the other. "You're in my guest room," she said plainly. "Don't try to move. I stitched what I could." He stared at her, blinking slow. "Why," her eyes didn't soften, but something behind them flickered. "Because God didn't put me on this earth to watch good men die while the wicked win." His throat tightened. "My girl's sleeping in my sewing room," she said. "Lahi's on a cot. Jeunesse in the cradle that was waiting for my baby." Silence fell between them. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Real. He looked away. "I ain't got nothing. Not even a name worth keeping." Clara placed the tray beside him. "Then you can borrow mine till you heal." Lahi didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the cot with her little sister curled beside her, staring at the rocking chair in the corner. The moonlight glinted off the fabric of the dress hanging from a hook on the door. It was a baby gown, soft, untouched. "Why do you think she bought us?" June whispered, eyes open. "I don't know," Lahi said. "But she smells like Mama used to." Micah's fever broke the next morning. He awoke to Clara sitting at the foot of his bed, knitting slowly, her fingers careful. She wasn't looking at him just working the yarn like the world depended on the next stitch. "You keep busy," he croaked. She smiled faintly. "Idle hands don't help grief." Micah studied her. Her eyes were swollen at the edges. Not fresh tears, old ones, buried ones. "You lost him, your husband." Clara nodded once. 2 months ago, Comanche arrow. He died before we knew about the baby. Micah swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Clara met his eyes. Don't be. He was good, and I loved him. But love doesn't leave us. It just changes shape. Micah's hand trembled against the sheets. I ain't sure how to repay you. You don't, she said quietly, but you will protect them, your daughters. That's how you repay me. He nodded slowly, jaw clenched. That night, a knock shook the door at midnight. Clara froze mid-step, hand on her lantern. Micah from the bed heard it too. Don't open it. I have to. Outside stood a man in a sheriff's badge and 2 others with guns drawn. The leader, stocky with grizzled sideburns, tipped his hat. Ma'am, sorry to wake you, but we have orders to retrieve 1 Micah Kalin and the 2 minors in his custody. Seems they were sold unlawfully by a next of kin. Clara didn't flinch. And you think I'll hand them over without question? Law says they ain't yours. Clara took a deep breath. Then the law can sit on my porch till dawn, while we read the Bible and talk about decency, because no one's dragging those girls into another wagon. The sheriff stepped forward. Ma'am, don't test me, she whispered. I've buried 1 man. I'll fight for these 3. A voice called from inside the house. Let him in. It was Micah. He stood wobbling in the hallway, his shoulder still wrapped, but he held the pistol. Clara had left on her writing desk. If they're here for me, I'll speak with them alone. Clara hesitated, but nodded. Micah stepped onto the porch. The door shut behind him. He returned 10 minutes later, pale and shaking. Clara caught him before he could fall. What happened? He didn't answer at first, but then he whispered, They're giving me 5 days to prove the girls are safer here or they'll take M. Clara's breath left her like wind out of the lungs. Micah looked her in the eye. There's one way to fix this. She froze. Micah didn't blink. If I was your husband, no one could take them. Clara didn't move at first. The words hung in the room like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet started. Her hand was still on Micah's arm, steadying him, but her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. A proposal, but not one born of love or romance. This was survival, a desperate knot tied in the darkness to keep children from being torn from safety. You don't even know me, she finally said. Micah stood straighter, despite the pain that flared behind his ribs. I know what you did, that you stepped in when no one else would. You bought me like a man buys hope. That's not marriage, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. No, he said, swallowing hard. It's a beginning. Clara turned away, heart pounding in her chest. She touched her swollen belly, the child stirring gently inside her, unaware of the storm outside its mother's ribcage. A war was being fought between what was right and what was practical, between the future she'd imagined and the one that was rising like a dust storm she couldn't outrun. What about your heart? She asked softly. Micah's jaw flexed. My heart's buried on a hillside 2 winters ago. My wife died with our 3rd child inside her. There ain't nothing in me left to give. But maybe that's why this makes sense. She turned slowly. Micah looked hollow, but honest. You're carrying grief. So am I. Maybe we can carry it together. Even if there's no love now, maybe. Maybe something like it grows where kindness starts. Clara's eyes glistened, not with tears, but recognition. The same hollow had lived inside her since Matthew died. This wasn't a man asking her to save him. It was a man offering his name to save her and the children. The silence stretched long. Then Clara gave a single tearful nod. They were married 3 days later by Reverend Tobias in the parlor. No music, no guests, just Clara in a pale blue dress that once belonged to her grandmother, and Micah in the only clean shirt that didn't cling to his healing wounds. The girls stood beside them, eyes wide and uncertain, still trying to understand what was happening. Reverend Tobias looked over the small gathering. Marriage is not always born in the furnace of romance, but often in the crucible of hardship. Do you vow to protect each other? I do, Micah said first, voice low, but firm. I do. Clara whispered, her hand tightening in his. And these children? The Reverend asked, eyes shining with understanding. Will you protect them like your own flesh, no matter what sorrow or danger comes? I will, they said in unison. The Reverend smiled. Then, by the authority granted to me, I pronounce you husband and wife. May God be your guide. They sat in silence later that night. The girls tucked away the house still. Clara poured tea. Micah didn't touch his. They weren't strangers anymore, but they weren't lovers either. They were something in between, bound by necessity, tied by a vow neither had expected. You don't have to pretend, Clara said suddenly. If it's too much the girl's the baby coming, you can sleep in the barn. Micah looked up. Do I strike you as the kind of man who hides from his promises? No, she admitted. You strike me as the kind of man who breaks under too much weight. Micah leaned forward. I'm not proud of how I got here. My brother betrayed me, stole my land, threw my girls into the hands of men who'd sooner see them chained than safe. I failed them. You didn't fail them, she said fiercely. You lived. You held on. That's not failure. That's defiance. He stared at her for a long moment. You always speak like that. Only when I believe someone's worth saving. Morning came with a letter nailed to the front post. Micah stepped outside, saw the folded paper pinned beneath a rusted horseshoe nail. His name was written in messy scrawl. He read it once, twice, then handed it silently to Clara. You may have tricked the law with your wedding, but I'll be back. I'll take the girls back one way or another. They're mine. Always were. Elin. Clara looked up slowly. Your brother. Micah's eyes darkened. Elas. And he thinks children are property? She asked coldly. Micah nodded. He does. Always did. He used them for sympathy after his wife left. When I refused to let him hurt them, he turned on me. Clara folded the letter neatly, then dropped it into the hearthfire. We're not afraid of him. Micah didn't answer. He only sat down, hand absently, drifting to the pistol resting on the table beside the lamp. That afternoon, Lahi approached Clara while she folded baby clothes in the sunlight of the front room. Mama Clara. Clara turned slowly, her breath catching. It was the first time either girl had called her anything other than Mom. Yes, sweetheart. Lahi twisted her fingers. Do you think if I learned to cook real good, you'd let me help when the baby comes? Clara knelt, tears suddenly prickling behind her eyes. You do want to help me? Lahi nodded. You helped us. Clara opened her arms, and Lahi folded into them like a bird into its nest. That small frame trembled, and Clara held her long and tight. You never have to prove your worth to me, she whispered. You're already enough. But Ellis came back. It was the 6th night after the wedding. Wind howling through the cracks in the barn, and the moon bleeding light across the yard. Micah had gone to check on the horses. Clara stood at the stove stirring broth when a crash came from the back door. By the time she turned, Elas was already inside. A gun in one hand, the smell of whiskey clinging to him like rot. You think you can take what's mine, he snarled. Clara's hands flew to her belly. They're not yours. They never were. They were born on my land, fed by my table. You think a wedding makes you their mother? Micah appeared in the doorway behind him. I think the girls chose who makes them feel safe. Micah growled. Ililia spun. You ain't even a man anymore. Look at you. Letting a woman pat you up, hiding behind a skirt. Micah raised the rifle. Put it down, Elas. But Elas only laughed and raised his own gun. A crack split the air. Elia stumbled back, then fell. Micah stood shaking the rifle, still smoking. Lahi screamed from the hallway. June burst into sobs. Clara moved fast, pulling the girls behind her as she crouched, her own hands trembling. Don't look, she whispered to them. Don't you dare look. Micah dropped the rifle, breathing hard. He was going to kill you, he rasped. I know, Clara said, her hand reaching for his. But now we have to protect the girls from what they saw. Micah nodded slowly, falling to his knees. Then, in the quiet, Lahi stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "You didn't fail us," she whispered. "You saved us." And for the first time in years, Micah wept. Not because he was weak, but because something long frozen inside him had cracked open and light, however faint, was beginning to shine through. The body was buried before sunrise. Micah didn't ask for help. He dug the hole himself, one arm bandaged and stiff sweat burning in his eyes. He didn't say a word when Clara came out in her shawl with a cup of water. He just kept digging, like if he stopped for even a second, the truth of what had happened would swallow him whole. She didn't press him. She just placed the water nearby and watched the first slivers of pink light creep over the hills. Lahi and June were asleep upstairs, curled in the same bed like kittens, clinging to warmth. Neither one had spoken since the shot. Clara finally stepped forward when the shovel hit stone. "You did what you had to," she said gently. Micah looked up, his eyes haunted. "He was still my blood." "No," Clara said firmly. "He stopped being your brother the day he laid hands on a child." He stared at her as if searching for some piece of mercy to lean on. She didn't flinch. "We bury the past, then we raise the living." The girls were quiet the next morning. Lahi helped slice bread for breakfast. Her small fingers careful, her mouth set in a firm line. June clung to her doll and stared out the window like she expected the wind to whisper threats. Clara watched them both and set her mug down. "Today, we clean the porch." Lahi blinked. "Why? Because it's dusty and the sun's shining." Clara replied, her voice bright. "And we've been living under shadows too long. Let's put our hands to something good." So they scrubbed. Clara fetched a pail and soap, and together they worked on the front steps until their sleeves were wet and their faces flushed. June giggled for the first time when Clara accidentally splashed her with suds. "Got you," Clara teased. June beamed. "Do it again." Micah stood just inside the door, leaning on the frame, his bandaged ribs wrapped tight beneath a clean shirt. He watched the scene with an expression that flickered somewhere between disbelief and longing. He hadn't seen the girls laugh like that in months, maybe longer. That night, Clara tucked them in and sang a hymn, low and soft. When she turned to leave, Lahi reached for her hand. "Don't leave yet," she whispered. So Clara stayed. She sat at the edge of the bed, one hand on Lahi's, the other resting on her own round belly. And in the stillness of that moment, something shifted. The girls were no longer guests, no longer burdens. They were hers, bone of her heart, if not her womb. But not all ghosts stay buried. Word spread fast in a town as small as Briar Hollow. The lawman, sheriff, and Lowe came knocking 3 days later, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. Micah met him on the porch. Clara stood behind the screen door, her hand hovering protectively over her belly. "Even in Micah," the sheriff said. "Sheriff Micah," replied, his voice calm. "You hear about Alas?" "I am. I didn't want to kill him." "I know." Sheriff and Lowe sighed and glanced toward the field. "You filed a statement. Didn't seem right. Thought it was family business. Normally, I'd agree," the sheriff said slowly. "But his cousin stirring trouble in town says you married just to dodge custody and then ambushed Elas in cold blood." Clara opened the door. "That's a lie." The sheriff looked at her, his eyes kind. "Ma'am, I'm sure it is, but folks are talking, and when people talk, judges listen if it comes to court." Micah stiffened. "We'll testify. The girls saw everything. They're children, Micah. Scared ones. A good lawyer will twist their words till the truth bleeds out of it." Clara Ara stepped forward. "Then we won't give him a chance." The sheriff tilted his head. "We'll leave," she said simply. "We'll go where no one knows us. We'll start again." Micah's heart thudded, but the sheriff shook his head. "Run, and you'll look guilty. Stay, and I'll do what I can. But you need more than my word. You need evidence, a witness, someone who saw Elias threaten you." Micah's jaw tightened. Clara touched his arm. "There's one person who might know," she said softly. The one who warned me in the general store the day I bought you. Her name was Ruthie Bell, a widow sharp-tongued and silver-haired who ran the apothecary and knew everything about everyone from behind her lay-curtained windows. Clara found her behind the counter labelling jars of chamomile and licorice root. I heard Ruthie said without looking up. "You always do," Clara said with a wry smile. Ruthie set her pen down. "You here for something stronger than tea, I take it?" "I need your memory." That made Ruthie look up now. That's a dangerous thing to ask a woman my age. "You saw him," Clara said quietly. "In the store? You warned me." Ruthie pursed her lips. "I did. Saw the way Alis looked at you like a snake sizing up a bird. Heard what he said about getting the girls back too. Made my skin crawl. Would you say that, under oath, Ruthie studied her for a long moment? You are asking me to stick my neck out. I'm asking you to help me keep two girls safe." Ruthie's gaze softened. "You got some fight in you, don't you?" "I'm not fighting," Clara said. "I'm protecting." "That's worse," Ruthie muttered. "All right, I'll do it." The hearing was set for the following week. Micah cleaned up as best he could, scars still fresh and stiff. Clara wore her best dress, the blue one, with the white buttons. The girls stayed home with a neighbour too frightened to speak in front of strangers. The judge was hard-eyed and stern, but not unkind. He listened to Sheriff and Lowe's testimony to Ruthie's recollection to Clara's calm, measured words. Then Micah took the stand. "I didn't kill him because of the girls." He said, "I killed him because he raised a gun at my wife, my children. He wasn't coming to take them. He was coming to destroy them." "And do you believe your marriage is legitimate?" the judge asked. Micah looked over at Clara. "It was born in hardship, but it's more real than anything I've known since my first wife passed." The judge nodded once. "And the girls, they're mine by love," Micah said. "If the law won't give me more, I'll settle for that." The courtroom was silent as the judge shuffled his papers. Then finally, "I find no cause to prosecute. The marriage is legal. Custody remains with the couple. Case dismissed." Micah let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. And when the gavel struck, it echoed like thunder, but it felt like mercy. They rode home in silence, hands clasped, the wind cool against their faces. That night, as the girls danced in the parlour to the sound of Clara's humming, Micah stood by the fire watching. Clara approached. "We're safe now." Micah looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. "No, we're something better." She tilted her head. "What's that?" He reached out, resting his hand over hers, over the round curve of her belly. "We're a family." And in the flickering lamplight, for the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like home. But the peace wouldn't last. 2 nights later, Micah went out to check the fence line. He never came back. Clara knew something was wrong the moment the clock struck midnight. Micah had taken his rifle and said he'd only be out an hour just to check on the fence near the northern pasture where the cattle had been spooked the night before. He'd kissed her. Temple smiled faintly at Lahi, who handed him a biscuit and a napkin and promised he'd be back before the fire burned down low. But midnight came, then 1, then 2, and still no Micah. The house creaked with the weight of silence. Clara sat by the window, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other holding a cold cup of tea. She didn't wake the girls. Something in her soul told her this night didn't need their fear layered atop hers. She just waited, prayed, whispered his name. At 3:30, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Clara stood too fast, her back tightening with the weight of the child inside her. She rushed to the door, flung it open, and saw the sheriff's horse. Sheriff Enlow dismounted slowly, his hat in his hands again, his face pale beneath the brim. His boots crunched against the frosted grass as he stepped onto the porch. He didn't speak right away. That silence was worse than a scream. Clara gripped the doorframe. "Tell me." "He's alive," the sheriff said quickly. "Barely." Clara staggered, her knees nearly giving way. What happened? He was ambushed. Found him near the North Creek, half covered in snow. Someone hit him over the head and left him for dead. Who and Lowe's jaw was tight. Best I can figure, someone didn't like how the trial ended. Clara's heart pounded. The cousin, maybe, or someone Illis paid off before he died. We'll dig. Where is Micah now? I took him to Doc Whitley's. He's breathing, but it's shallow. Head wound's bad. Could be days before he wakes if he wakes. Clara's hand went to her mouth. The sheriff looked at her belly, then toward the upstairs window where Lahi and June still slept. He's strong, Clara. If anyone can pull through. She didn't hear the rest. She was already gathering her shawl, her boots, the thick coat she patched for Micah weeks ago. She kissed both girls lightly on the forehead, whispered that she'd be back by breakfast, and rode with the sheriff into town beneath the thinning stars. Micah looked like a man caught between this world and the next. The bandage around his head was stained dark red. His lips were cracked. His skin had lost all its warmth, but his chest still rose slow and shallow as the old doctor wiped a cloth across his brow and muttered under his breath. Clara didn't cry. She couldn't. She sat beside the cot and took his hand, gently brushing the calluses with her thumb. "Come back to me," she whispered. "You said we were a family. Don't let that be the last thing you ever said to me." She stayed like that until dawn, humming the same hymn she sang to the girls. Back at the ranch, Lahi awoke to an empty house. At first she thought it was a dream. The fire was low. June's head was on her shoulder. But the smell of coffee was absent in Clara's footsteps, always so rhythmic like a lullaby were missing. Then she saw the note on the table. "Gone to town. Micah's hurt. I'll be back. Stay inside. Lock the doors. Be brave." Lahi's chest squeezed so tight she couldn't breathe. "June," she whispered, shaking her sister. "Get up." June blinked her eyes, foggy with sleep. "What's wrong?" "We got to hide." Clara returned just after noon. She was exhausted. Her eyes ached from lack of sleep, and her throat was raw from holding in sobs. But the sight of the house still standing chimney-puffing smoke was enough to keep her moving until she opened the front door. The house was empty. No laughter, no footsteps, no little dolls scattered across the rug, just a trail of small muddy footprints leading from the back door into the woods beyond. She screamed their names. Nothing. Panic surged so hard she dropped to her knees. Lahi had led June into the old root cellar. It was their hiding place. Micah had shown them where it was weeks ago, told them that if danger ever came when he wasn't home, that's where they should go. It smelled like potatoes and dirt, and the wood was cracked, but it felt safe. "Do you think she'll come back?" June asked, shivering. "She said she would," Lahi whispered, holding her close. "We just got to wait." They didn't know how long they sat there. The sun shifted. Their legs grew numb. Lahi whispered stories to keep June from crying. Tales of brave ranchers and mighty women who protected babies with nothing but grit and a prayer. Then came the knock. Soft at first, then harder, then the voice. "You girls in there." It was Clara. It was Micah. It was a man. And he sounded like he was smiling. Clara ran until her lungs burned. She searched the woods behind the house. She checked the barn, the corral, the coop. She screamed their names again and again, tripping over roots and falling to her knees in the frost. Then she saw it. The faint outline of a boot print near the well. Too big to be Lahi's. Definitely not June's. Her heart stopped. She turned and bolted toward town. The man outside the root cellar knocked again. "I ain't here to hurt you. Just want to talk." Lahi covered June's mouth. The door creaked. Then the man laughed. "Well, if you ain't going to come out, maybe I'll just light this here match and see how quick you change your mind." John gasped. La's eyes went wide. Then a thud. The man yelped. Another thud. Then silence. Then the door opened and sunlight poured in. And standing there with a pitchfork in her hand and fury in her eyes was Ruthie Bell. "I came to check on y'all," Ruthie muttered, her hands shaking. "Got a feeling something wasn't right. Heard that snake muttering to himself by the barn. Took care of him." She helped the girls out one by one, clutching them to her chest. "It's all right now." You're safe." Lahi stared at her. "You hit him. Square on the back of his head. He'll be seeing stars till Judgment Day." June sniffled. I was scared. Ruthie knelt. That's what courage means, baby. Being scared, but not quitting. Clara arrived at Ruthie's cabin just as the sheriff was hauling the unconscious man into town. The girls ran into her arms like the floodgates had broken. Clara wept, holding them both, rocking them back and forth. "I thought I lost you," she whispered over and over. "You didn't," Lahi sobbed. "We waited, just like you said." Micah awoke 3 days later. The first thing he saw was the curve of Clara's belly beneath a quilt, her hand resting on it like she was guarding treasure. Then he saw La asleep in the chair beside him, June curled up at her feet. He blinked. "We still here?" Clara smiled through her tears. "By God's grace we are." He reached for her hand. She gave it. "I thought I lost everything," he whispered. "You almost did," she said. "But we fought back, all of us." He looked around, dazed but smiling. "I didn't think I'd ever have this again." Clara leaned forward, her lips brushing his knuckles. "You didn't have it," she said. "You built it." But peace is a fragile thing in the West. And just as the family began to settle, a telegram arrived. It was addressed to Micah. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were unmistakable. "I know who killed your brother, and it wasn't you." Micah sat up too fast and nearly passed out. Clara caught him, her hands bracing his shoulders before he could slump forward again. "You're not ready to be up," she said, voice gentle but firm. He blinked at the sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, at Lahi curled at the foot of the bed with June half on top of her, and at the telegram in his trembling hand. "I need to know who sent this," Micah said, still breathless, staring at the words again. "I know who killed your brother, and it wasn't you." Clara picked up the envelope. No return address. Just the telegram office stamp from Sweetwater Junction, almost 80 Maumee West, near the river crossings. Micah, if someone knows the truth, then someone's been watching and waiting. He looked at her belly at their girls. "And that means we ain't safe." "Not yet." Clara swallowed hard. "Then we find out who it is together." By the end of the week, the bruises on Micah's face had faded to pale yellow, and the swelling in his skull had gone down enough that Doc Whitley allowed him to walk slowly without help. The girls wouldn't leave his side. Lahi brought him his boots every morning. June brushed his beard and declared him handsome enough to ride again. Clara couldn't stop watching him, memorizing every blink, every breath, as if terrified he'd vanish again. Micah let it happen. He didn't mind the fuss. After all he'd endured. The auction, the beating, the frostbite, the fear of losing everything again. He welcomed the warmth, the quiet mornings with Clara's hand in his, the smell of biscuits baking, while June and Lahi argued over whose chores were done better. But at night he read the telegram again over and over. And on the 6th day, as the sky turned lavender with evening, he saddled the horse himself. Clara met him in the barn doorway. "I'm coming too," she said, chin up. "You shouldn't be riding in your condition," he murmured, adjusting the cinch. "You think I'm letting the father of my child ride off to some unknown town after someone tried to murder him last week?" Micah hesitated. "I don't want to risk you." Clara stepped closer. "Then don't leave me behind." He looked down at her, at the tiny scar above her left eyebrow, at the freckles across her cheeks that no sun could erase. He thought of the day he saw her in that auction crowd, one hand on her belly, the other on a coin purse, buying a broken man and his 2 girls. And he nodded. They left before dawn, riding west with Lahi and June, waving from the porch, Ruthie standing guard behind them with a rifle taller than June. Clara had packed dried fruit and biscuits. Micah carried 2 pistols, one hidden in the saddlebag. Sweetwater Junction was dry, cracked, and crooked. Half the storefronts leaned sideways like they'd been built drunk. A single street ran through the middle ending at the river ferry. The telegraph office was beside a leaning chapel whose bell had long since fallen silent. Micah dismounted with a grunt. Clara helped him steady. The telegraph clerk was a round man with red cheeks and half a moustache. Name's Hadley. What can I do for you? Micah showed him the telegram. Hadley squinted. Yep, came through 4 days ago. Messenger dropped it off in person. In person, Clara asked. Not over wire? Nope. Tall man. Wore a hat low and a scarf high. Paid me 2 silver coins to write it by hand and deliver it to the address he gave. Didn't want his name tied to nothing. Told me this is for a man that deserves truth. Then left. Did he say where he was headed? Only said, if he wants to find me, tell him to ask the woman in the green shack near the bend. Clara and Micah exchanged glances. The shack wasn't hard to find. It sat just off the river tucked behind tall reeds and a willow tree so old it looked like it had survived 5 floods. It leaned worse than any building in town, and smoke drifted from its crooked chimney like a thread of black ribbon. A woman sat on the porch peeling potatoes into a cracked bowl. Her hands were gnarled from age or arthritis. A green shawl wrapped her shoulders. Her eyes, blue and sharp, met theirs before they'd even spoken. I was wondering how long it would take you. Micah stepped forward. You sent that telegram? The woman snorted. Me heaven no. But I told him what to write. Poor fool was too nervous to get it straight. Kept asking if you'd remember him. Remember him? She nodded toward the porch. He's inside, hiding like a coward. Micah and Clara exchanged another glance and then stepped through the door. The man who stood inside the shack had once been tall, broad and sure. Now his shoulders hunched as if he were used to ducking fists or dodging questions. His hair had thinned and gone silver at the temples, and the beard that covered half his face looked like it had grown not from pride, but from hiding. When he turned and met Micah's eyes, his voice cracked. I didn't think you'd come. Micah stepped forward. His legs still ached, the limp still there, but his eyes burned hotter than any fire. You, Jeremiah Kessler. Clara stepped closer, instinctively touching Micah's back. Jeremiah gave a nod so small it could have been missed. I thought you died that day at the cabin. They said no one made it out alive. You were there. Micah's voice came low, nearly a growl. I was part of it, Jeremiah whispered, but I never shot. I swear to you, I never raised my rifle. Micah looked like he'd been slapped. Part of it you stood with the men who murdered my brother, who burned our homestead to ash. And you never told a soul. I was 17. I followed Wade Harmon into that mess, thinking we were just talking backland. He lied. Said the land was stolen from his kin by your paw. I didn't know until I heard your brother screaming. Micah's jaw tightened. You saw him die. Jeremiah's eyes filled with tears. He didn't scream in fear, Micah. He screamed for you. Told you to run. Kept telling the men, he's just a boy, don't hurt him. Clara held her breath, watching Micah's hands curl into fists. You saw me? Micah asked. Jeremiah nodded. You ran through the barn. That bullet clipped your shoulder. I told Harmon I'd seen you fall. I lied. I wanted you to live. You could have told the sheriff. You could have testified. I tried. Jeremiah's voice cracked. Harmon had half the count bought. When he found out I was thinking of talking, he sent men after me. I lost my left hand in a fire set to scare me off. Micah's eyes dropped to the man's gloved hand. He hadn't noticed before, but now the shape looked stiff, unnatural. Jeremiah peeled the glove off slowly, revealing a burned, gnarled stump where his thumb and most of his palm used to be. I left everything, Jeremiah continued. Changed my name, hid. But when I saw the flyer, when I heard they put you in chains for Harmon's death, I knew I couldn't stay quiet. Clara's voice was soft but steady. Then why not come to the ranch, tell the sheriff directly because Harmon had children, and they've got sway in the courts now. They'd ruin me, but they don't know I'm alive or where I am. If I showed up in town, I'd vanish before I could speak a word. Micah stood silent, staring at a man he once called a cousin. Jeremiah stepped closer, voice trembling. I wrote it all down. Everything, every name, every time. I kept a record just in case. It's buried out back. I didn't want to die without someone knowing the truth." Micah didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, with pain in his voice, he said, "You let me suffer a decade under the weight of that fire. My brother's blood on my hands. My girls think I'm strong, but they don't know what I see every time I close my eyes. You let me rot, and now you want peace." Jeremiah looked down. "No, Micah. I don't want peace. I just want to stop hiding and maybe help you find yours." The record was real. Dozens of pages wrapped in oilskin and buried in a rusted tin behind the shack, just like he said. Micah and Clara read every page by lantern light that night. Names Micah hadn't thought of in years. Sheriff Whitley's predecessor, Mayor Thomas Ranchers from up north who'd claimed Harmon as kin and spread the lies about Micah's family stealing land. There it all was, dates, locations, numbers, handwriting, so shaky Micah could barely read it. But it was real, and it changed everything. The ride home was quiet. Micah didn't speak much. He just held Clara Ara's hand every time she reached for him, kissed her forehead each night by the campfire, and let the girls crawl into his lap when they met them at the fence line 2 days later. But he had a plan. Micah waited until Sunday. He dressed in clean clothes, shaved, and took his daughters to church. Clara walked beside him, glowing under her hat, one hand on her belly. The whole town stared as they entered. Even Sheriff Barrow stopped mid-step when he saw them coming. They sat near the front. When the sermon ended, Micah stood. "Folks," he said, voice strong, "I got something to say." The room froze. "I know most of y'all think I'm a killer. You think I burned my own brother and left him to die. I never corrected you, never argued. I figured the truth wouldn't matter to people who already made up their minds." He reached into his coat and pulled out the oilskin bundle. "But the truth has been found." He laid the records on the altar. "This here's a full confession from a man who stood with Wade Harmon the day my brother was murdered. He names every man involved and he names the ones who covered it up." Murmurs broke out across the room. Micah's voice rose steady and filled with decades of pain. "I didn't come here for vengeance. I came here for my girls, for the woman who saved me, for the child we got common. I want them to grow up in a town that knows truth matters, that the Lord still brings light out of dark." Sheriff Barrow stepped forward, eyes on the bundle. "May I?" Micah nodded. Baal flipped through the pages, his face darkening with every name he read. "Where's the man who wrote this?" he asked. "He's under protection," Clara answered. "And if anything happens to him, copies of those records go to the state marshal." Baal gave a slow nod. "Then we've got work to do." By Thursday, 4 men had been arrested. 2 resigned from office. The mayor didn't show up for work at all. And for the first time in over a decade, Micah stood in town without being watched like a wolf among sheep. The girls ran ahead of him, chasing each other between barrels and crates, laughter ringing like bells. Clara walked beside him, her hand resting on her growing belly. When they passed the blacksmith, old Jasper tipped his hat. "Good to see you up, Micah." Micah smiled. "Good to be seen." That night, as wind rocked the windows and rain tapped the shingles, Micah sat on the porch with Clara, arms wrapped around her from behind. "I never thought I'd see the day," he whispered. "You never stopped fighting for it," Clara said. "I wanted to give up. When I lost Sarah, when they took my name, I was just a ghost." Clara leaned into him. "Then I'm glad I married a ghost because you gave me life when I had none left." Micah turned her gently to face him, brushing damp curls from her cheek. "You saved me," he whispered. "Not the records, not the truth. You," Clara touched his face. "Then let me be your home forever." He kissed her under the rain, the quiet falling around them like grace. And in the dark behind them, Lahi whispered to June. Papa smiled like that when Mama used to sing. He stepped close, brushing her cheek with the back of his hand. You, Clara, laughed, shaking her head as she rested her hand on her belly. "You know, for a man who spent so many years quiet, you sure have learned how to talk sweet." He kissed her forehead. "You made it easy." They didn't know it yet, but word of Micah's name being cleared had spread well beyond their county. Within a week, letters arrived. One from the state marshal's office confirming an investigation, and another from an old friend of his brother S offering to help rebuild the cabin that had been burned to the ground all those years ago. Folks who had once crossed the street to avoid Micah now came by, with Cassler's fresh eggs and apologies they didn't quite know how to word. Some said, "Sorry, I believe the worst." Others said nothing at all, just pressed his hand and nodded eyes wet with guilt. Micah accepted each one with quiet grace, never rubbing salt into the old wounds. But he never forgot, and more than once he was caught staring out across the land, eyes fixed on the place where the cabin used to stand. One evening, the girls were helping Clara fold laundry by the fire when Lahi asked softly, "Mama Clara, where's the baby gonna sleep?" Clara paused, one hand resting on a little bonnet she'd just sewn. "Well," she said with a smile, "I was thinking we'd move your bed closer to June's and turn the corner into a cradle spot." "But what if the baby cries at night?" June asked, thoughtful as ever. "Papa still has nightmares sometimes. Will it wake him up?" The question made Clara pause longer than she meant to. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "your papa's nightmares have been sleeping more lately too." June nodded and went back to her mending, but Lahi whispered, "I'll sing to the baby. That way, everybody sleeps." Micah heard the whole conversation from the hallway and had to step away before they saw his tears. By midweek, a writer came with news. The land Micah's father once owned, the very acreage Wade Harmon had claimed through forged deeds, was being re-examined by the court. There was strong evidence of theft now, and the new mayor, a woman with no ties to Harmon's legacy, had begun the process to return the land to Micah's name. Clara clutched his arm as the messenger rode off. "Micah," she whispered, "that's your family land." He nodded, staring at the distant hills, "and maybe it's time I built a new home there." They visited the site a few days later, traveling light with just some bread, a blanket, and a pocket Bible. The chimney was still there, half buried under vines and ash. Lahi asked if she could climb it. June wandered off to examine the creek. Micah knelt and touched the scorched earth. "Do you want to rebuild here?" Clara asked, gently crouching beside him. He didn't answer right away. His fingers dug lightly through the dirt, tracing a circle around where the hearthstone had once been. Then, finally, he said, "I think I want to start new right next to this place. Not on it. No," he said, "this ground has memory pain. I want the house where the girls sleep, and our child grows to be just a little further on where the sun hits in the morning. But I'll keep this chimney. I want them to know what came before." Clara squeezed his hand. "Then let's build it together." That same night, just as they returned home, Clara doubled over on the porch step. Micah caught her before she hit the ground. "Contraction?" he asked, voice tight. She winced, then exhaled. I think so, but it's early." "I'm not ready." He held her hand steady as ever. "Then we'll get ready." June ran to fetch the midwife. Lahi clutched Clara's shawl and whispered prayers. Within the hour, the midwife arrived and ushered Clara to the bedroom, setting down her satchel and rolling up her sleeves. "It might be false labor," she told Micah, "but we'll be sure." Micah paced the hall. Every cry from Clara brought back memories he'd buried deep. Memories of his first wife Sarah gripping his hand, of blood on the bedsheets, of losing more than just a child that terrible day. But this was different. This time he was stronger, and Clara, she wasn't fading. She was glowing. The contractions passed by morning. The midwife nodded. "False alarm, but your baby's restless, and your body's preparing. You're close." Micah tucked Clara into bed with shaking hands, grateful beyond words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't ever say that. I know how much pain is in your past. I didn't want this baby to come wrapped in fear." Micah kissed her hand. "This child is coming wrapped in love. That's all that matters." Later that week, as repairs on the ranch continued, Micah took a break from lifting beams and stood in the new nursery they'd started framing. He could already picture the cradle, the little carved dresser, the quilt Clara was sewing by lamplight. A knock came on the door frame. Sheriff Ball stood there, hat in hand. "You got a moment?" Micah nodded. "Sure." Barrow stepped in and looked around. "Place is looking good." "Thank you." Barrow hesitated. "I came to tell you Harmon's oldest son Roy was arrested in Santa Fe, tried to bribe a judge to destroy land records. He'll face federal charges." Micah nodded, heart-heavy, but grateful. "Justice has a long road." "It does," Barrow agreed. "But you walked it better than most." He extended a letter toward Micah. "What's this?" Micah asked. "Letter from the governor, combination and a request." Micah frowned. "Request?" Ball smiled. "They want to ask if you consider running for county commissioner. Seems like a man who stood through fire and still came out honest is hard to come by." Micah didn't speak. He just stared at the envelope, heart thudding. Clara found him an hour later, still standing in the nursery. "You all right?" He handed her the letter. She read it, eyes wide. "Micah, this is he." He nodded. "I don't know if I'm the man for that." "You're exactly the man," she said, "and I'll stand beside you every step." That night under a sky filled with stars and the sound of frogs croaking down by the creek. Micah sat on the porch with both girls asleep against his sides. Clara rocked in the chair beside him, one hand on her stomach, humming a quiet hymn. Micah watched the horizon, then looked down at his daughters, then at his wife. He spoke without turning his head. "You know what I think." "What's that?" "I think the Lord doesn't just restore what was lost. Sometimes He gives you something you didn't even know you needed." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "And sometimes," she whispered, "He gives it back sevenfold." Micah reached over, took her hand, and held it against his heart. Then, "Let's build this life, Clara. From the ashes, all of it." But before she could answer, Clara gasped and grabbed his arm. Micah turned eyes wide. "What is it?" Her breath came quick, her hand gripping tighter. "I think, Micah, I think it's time." Clara's voice shook as she clung to Micah's arm. "I think it's time." Micah didn't ask again. He saw it in her eyes, the tightness of her jaw, the sudden shift in her breathing, the way her hand found his and didn't let go. He'd seen it before, but this time there was no fear in him, only urgency, only faith. He scooped her into his arms without a word and carried her into the house through the flickering lantern light, past the rocking chair where she'd hummed to the unborn child only moments ago. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, and the hush of the world outside disappeared behind the closing door. "June Lahi." The girls woke immediately, Lahi rubbing her eyes, and June already on her feet. "It's the baby," June whispered, running for the water bucket. "I'll get Miss Martha," Lahi said, already racing for her shoes. Micah's voice was calm but firm. "Go fast and careful." He carried Clara to their room and laid her gently on the bed, brushing the hair from her damp forehead. Her hand found his again. "I'm not ready," she whispered, trembling. "Yes, you are." "No, it's too soon. What if something goes wrong?" Micah knelt beside her, both hands on hers. "Then we face it together, like we've done everything else. You hear me, Clara?" Her eyes were wide, tears pooling. "I don't want to lose you," she choked out. "You're not going to," he said, "because I've already lost too much and God didn't bring us this far just to leave us." He kissed her hand, then her cheek, then whispered into her hair, "You are the strongest woman I've ever known." She let out a small sob and nodded. Okay. Martha arrived within minutes. The old midwife moved with surprising speed and purpose, even at her age. She entered like a storm, quiet, but absolute. "Boil water," she said to June. "Bring me clean towels. Lahi, get your little hands washed and stay nearby, but don't hover." Micah stepped back, then forward again, hovering despite himself. "You stay," Martha said, nodding at him. "She'll need you. Just don't faint." Clara managed a weak smile. He won't. And Micah didn't. He stood beside her, wiping her forehead, holding her hand through every shudder and cry, every deep breath and whispered prayer. The house faded away, and time seemed to stretch each minute longer than the last. Outside, the stars wheeled on the night deepened, and then a sound so small, so thin at first, it barely rose above a whisper. Then louder a cry, then another, and then silence. And for one horrible heartbeat, Micah thought. But then Martha turned smiling tears in her eyes. She lifted the small bundle, slick and squirming, and handed the child to Clara. "It's a boy," she said. Clara sobbed, clutching the baby to her chest. Micah dropped to his knees. A son. After years of silence, after war, after wounds and shame and fire, he had a son and a wife who lived, and 2 daughters who stood in the doorway, crying and laughing all at once. He could hardly speak. He leaned forward and kissed Clara Ara's forehead, then kissed the baby's crown, damp with birth and heat. "What will we name him?" Clara whispered. Micah stared at the tiny face, then said softly, "Elas." Clara looked at him. "After your brother?" Micah nodded. "He's the reason I survived. And now this child, he's the reason I'll keep living." They wrapped Elas in a quilt Clara had sewn from scraps pieces of the girls' old dresses, a square from Micah's shirt, and a bit of lace from her mother's handkerchief. He was small, but strong. He latched easily and curled against Clara's chest, as if he had always known her voice. By morning, the sun was rising over the hills, and Micah stood out on the porch, Elas cradled in his arms. The land stretched before him, fields that would grow again, barns that would be mended fences that would hold. The ranch would breathe again, not just as a place to survive, but to thrive. Clara joined him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He's got your eyes," she said, "and your temper." Micah added, "He's a day old." "I can tell already," he teased. The girls came out barefoot, yawning, and clung to their father's sides. "Can we help feed him?" Lahi asked. "You already are," Micah said. "Every smile you give him, every laugh you share, it feeds his little heart." Clara looked at him, her eyes full of wonder. "You really never thought you'd be here, did you?" He shook his head. "I thought I'd die with a rifle in my hand and no one left to mourn me. But now," he looked at them all, his wife, his daughters, his son. "Now I've got more than I ever dreamed." The land was theirs within the month. The state returned ownership of the Harmon acres to Micah, and he immediately deeded part of it to Clara in her own name, something she hadn't expected. When she asked why, he said plainly, "Because I want you to know you've always belonged here. Not because of me, because of you." They rebuilt together. Walls were raised a new home, taking shape with wide windows and stone hearths. Every nail, every board was a promise of permanence. Clara oversaw the kitchen design, making space for a cradle in the corner and a rocking chair by the window. Micah built a bookshelf by hand, one that would hold the family Bible and the girls' future school books. The first dinner in the new house was simple cornbread stew and fresh milk, but it felt like a feast. They held hands around the table, and June offered the prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for making our family whole, and for baby Elas and Mama not dying and Papa smiling more." Micah opened his eyes and laughed, wiping tears away. Clara Ara squeezed his hand. It was a good life. Letters kept coming. People Micah had helped without knowing. Families who'd seen his trial and found courage in it. A church in another county wrote to ask if he'd speak to their men about rebuilding faith after war. A boy from town brought a lamb to the gate one morning saying, "P says you're the best man he ever doubted. He told me to give you this for Elas." Micah took the lamb stunned. Clara whispered later, "See, God restores what was stolen." Micah believed her now more than ever. And then, one Sunday morning, as they walked home from church, Clara took Micah's hand and said something so quietly he nearly missed it. "I never told you this, but the day I bought you at that auction, I didn't know why I raised my hand." He turned to her surprised. I mean, I had no plan, no idea who you were. I just looked at you, and something inside said, that man needs saving. But now I know." She stopped walking, facing him. "I didn't save you, Micah. You saved me. All of us." Micah swallowed the lump in his throat and pulled her into his arms right there in the dusty road. Then we saved each other. Years passed. Lahi became a bold rider, always chasing storms. June took to music, playing hymns by ear on a hand-me-down piano. Ellis learned to walk before he was 1, and his first word was mama, but his second was papa, and Micah never got over that. One night, years later, as the fire crackled and the wind stirred the curtains, Clara found Micah sitting alone in the nursery. Ellis had just turned 5. Micah was holding the same quilt they'd wrapped him in at birth. "You all right?" she asked softly. He nodded, eyes far away, just thinking. About what? About how the Lord never forgot me. Even when I thought he had, even when the world turned its back, he was still leading me to you. Clara knelt beside him and laid her head on his shoulder. And he was leading me to you. Outside, the stars shimmered like they did the night Alice was born. And somewhere in the quiet distance, the old cottonwood tree stood firm on the ridge, its branches reaching upward, its roots deep in the soil of a land where pain had once ruled, but where love finally had taken hold. The end.